Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Toward the weekend, certainly. How do you spend your weekend days? Do you like mountain hiking, mountain climbing? 무등산, great mountain, which is internationally known. So, we will follow on the governmental system and some areas of comparative public law. So separation of powers, constitution, judicial review, and a generous court hierarchy will be reviewed in this class. As you see, the separation of powers principle is essential to ensure a democratic form of government. For example, United States Constitution is one of the notable examples. We see the tripartite government was incorporated into constitutional scheme. This idea is essential to safeguard against the arbitrary abuse of absolute power, particularly the context of monarchy. Seriously operated to create this idea. And it is a bulwark about human liberty in modern concept of democracy. You see, there are a scope of varied forms of constitution. And for example, the types of state also so a different approach about the state framework. For example, we have a unitary system of government, but United States is a federal state, and also Germany is a federal state, which is unlike the Republic of France and United Kingdom. Of course, in federalism, there is also a points of a difference. For example, Germany, the federal system of Germany and the United States are quite distinctive among another. And we normally use the term representative democracy and constitutional democracy, and also the term of republic. Those terms are dominant in exploring a modern discourse of a contemporary democracy. For example, the representative democracy is the term to see the sources of power for the general people, and they usually favor a fair election and participatory framework of a democracy. Most typically, we can see it bicameralism in the United States. The Senate usually considered a kind of an institutional meditation, which is sophisticated over the unification of a new republic. However, the House of Representatives is directly concerned about a democratic representation. So the kind of concept would combine to shape the United States. And also, there are a scope of forms that the modern states have adopted a state constitution. For example, with a constitutional monarchy, which is typically attributed to the Commonwealth of Nations, including Canada and United Kingdom. They have a symbolic monarch who has no practical power over the process, democratic process. And also, United Kingdom adopted a bicameralism. One goes to House of Lords, and the lower unit would be House of Commons. So we can see a similar dynamics in the United Kingdom also, but there are a historical background which is different, a little different, and gave some distinct status between two units. Generally, in the United Kingdom, House of Commons would be considered a prevailing in institutional context of the House of Lords, and a limited power are vested within the House of Lords. And also, you need to be get aware if we use the term republic. What is a republic? The term usually denotes the preserve of a sovereign power in a specific nation. For example, if you can say a republic, then it is not incorrect that you may legitimately imagine that the state finally recalls the legitimacy to the general base of people, which is as a way of definition in contrast with the monarchy. Along with this rubrics, we need to have awareness that there is operating a kind of a civic virtue, long heritage through the Western democracies. What is civic virtue? Civic virtue has covered the scope of values and tested themes of the evolution of a modern democracy. For example, the rule of law, separation of powers, and individual freedom, and other a crucial commands from kind of a revolutionary context would approach powerfully to get through the kind of a framework. So one of each testing point could arise from this a civic virtue concept. So as we advance to explore the public comparative law in briefs over a civil law tradition, you need to be introduced about that kind of a basic information for your understanding. Then, how do we assess the separation of powers in civil law tradition? Separation of powers means something quite different in the European context from what has come to mean in the United States. Historically, notions about the proper distribution of power among the organs of government were shaped in England and in Europe generally by the struggles of representative assemblies against the rule of monarchs. In France, the doctrine of separation of powers was further affected by the profound revolutionary reaction there against the regal role that the judiciary played in the ancient regime. This background is in marked contrast to the United States, where neither the fear of government by judges nor the dogma of legislative supremacy played a much of a role in the formative period. Many of the framers of the American Constitution did fear, however, the unprecedented power of relatively a popular state of legislature as a threat to property and commerce. Therefore, Chief Justice Marshall in Marbury, Madison, did not have to deal with deep-seated attitudes that in Europe have been powerful obstacles to the establishment of a judicial review. Separation of powers to an American evokes the familiar system of checks and balances among the three coordinate branches of government: legislative, executive and judiciary, each with its independent constitutional basis. To European, it is a moral rigid doctrine and inseparable from the notion of a legislative supremacy. So you see some essence about a judicial review, which is created in case law, a moral medicine. So, you know, if you visit the court of a Korean Supreme Court, you see a big shingle bearing the capital letters, a 자유, 평등, and that is a primacy of a Supreme Court rule over the various country, liberalist states, for typology. And you see, the role of code in Anglo-Saxon legal system and other several countries usually concern critically about the civil framework, including a sanctity of property and freedom of contract. Those two concepts are important in an extensive context over a civil capitalism, a bourgeois capitalism. So, against the kind of Anglo-Saxon tradition, the separation of powers dominance came a little weakened context in European states. So, as you see through the layer of this class, the public administration, or the kind of a public course, and some of anxiety and a contention against the judiciary would not be less powerful over the European legal tradition. We have already seen the significance of doctrine of legislative supremacy for the role of the executive in parliamentary governments. So far as the judiciary is concerned, the doctrine and its extreme not only has been sought to exclude judicial power to review the legality of legislative, executive, and administrative action, but has ever been invoked to deny the court's lawmaking function by interpretation of a legislative text. However, these logical implications of legitimate supremacy have not prevented modern civil law systems from moving increasingly towards some form of judiciary, nor have they diminished the growing de facto importance of case law. So the judicial review is dynamic to ensure the fundamental rights of minority. In general sense, that a critical law would go to some fundamental context of individuals. And there will also be concern about the current class structure spreading over a top and through the bottom, and some kind of a polarization now be subject to a social criticism seriously. So the kind of a fundamental contention would growingly be reformed through the wake of a evolution within the capitalist society. So you have a kind of positive intervention of a state authority to rearrange the social justice within a pure market system. So the kind of version will be a frequent of your lectures in this university. The rigid European version of separation of powers has had long-lasting effects on the structure of court systems in most civil law countries. So, I've forgone my preparation. Sorry. I have to show this for your vision. A number of this course may be used. So you see the labor course of Germany, which is a modern form of architects. You see, unlikely, most unlikely in a European country. The principle of legislative supremacy and in France, mistrust of judiciary seems to rule out the possibility of judicial review of the legality of administrative action or of adjudication by ordinary courts of disputes between agencies of the government. Yes, some institutional mechanism for dealing with these matters was closely needed. In France, this was made one of the responsibilities of the Council of State, CLT.2, the central organ of a governmental administration. A number of nations, including Belgium and Italy, have followed the French model. In other nations, such as Austria and West Germany, such disputes are handled by the judiciary, but within a separate system of administrative courts. Thus, the typical civil law system contains at least two separate sets of courts for administrative and private law matters, each with its own Supreme Court, its own procedural and substantive rules, and its own jurisdiction. This is in striking contrast with the unified American system, where a single set of courts within each state and at the federal level is both public and private law matters, and even has a government. And most developed in Germany, you can see branches of a higher courts, which authority is usually submissive in uniform fashion to one highest court, what is Supreme, a German constitutional court. And you can see briefly later in this class about and we now on the venture of a explanation about a constitution, which is would be brief, but however, let's see first the West Germany in terms of its constitutional law. My lecture was based on the excerpts of the article prepared by S.C. Feiner, which is titled 5 Constitution. It features in Law Journal, Ohio, the University of Ohio State University, which was produced in 1974. If one turns to the German Constitution of 1949, one is struck by as a provisional character, by its emphasis on individual liberties, which equals, if it does not exceed, that of the American Constitution. By the sheer number of the clauses that define the federal-state relationship, by the downgrading of the presidency and corresponding strengthening of the chancellorship, and by the very tight restrictions placed upon emergence powers and defense arrangements. Each of these reflects a reaction to the special circumstances in which the Constitution was elaborated and to the regime from which the German people had just escaped. In 1949, Germany was still occupied by the Allied forces. Step by reluctant step, the three Western powers the USA, Britain, and France had united their zones of occupation for economic purpose, had licensed political parties, inaugurated municipal elections, recarved the country into provinces, and established land governments in them. So you can see some historical pathway that the German constitutional system was created. The Cold War was enforcing. The Soviet Union was Bolshevizing the Eastern Zone. In March 1949, it worked out of the four-power Control Council, and in April initiated the Berlin blockade. Therefore, on the 1st July, the three Western allies, acting independently of the Soviet Union, asked the heads of the 11 land governments to convene a constitutional assembly and draft a constitution for Germany that will be both democratic and federal. How do you see the federal system? If it goes to the federal system, then the state power may get stable to adapt to the surrounding powers. Should Germany be lessened to say the belligerence, kind of a political deliberation would be serious over that kind of issues. But the principal concern of these land presidents, prior to considering any text, was to nothing that would perpetuate, let alone legitimate, the de facto division of Germany. Also, they found themselves forced to steer a course between the loose federalism pressed on them by the French and the Americans, which some of German Christian Democrats favored, and the tight centralization on which German Social Democratic Party insisted, even to the point of quitting the discussions at one stage. The first of these two concerns find expression in the preamble. The traditional provisions in Article 146. The preamble speaks of new order to political life for a transitional period, qualified this by making it on behalf of those Germans to whom preparation was denied, and participation was denied. States further that the entire German people are called upon to achieve the free self-determination, the unity and freedom of Germany. The transitional provisions draw our attention to the land boundaries, refugees, expellees to occupation costs, and the land. And the final article, number 146, states, the basic law shall cease to be enforced on the day on which the Constitution adopted by a free decision of German people comes into force. The second concern is reflected in the sheer complication of the articles concerning the Federation. The first draft Constitution, which was completed on 24 August 1948 and submitted to the occupation authorities on 2nd March 1949, was a feather that the Social Democrats worked out of the Constitutional Council. They insisted that German judicial and economic unity had to be guaranteed, and that the federal government must have finances adequate to its tasks, and that there must be a uniform social policy. The Allies responded on 22nd April, markedly softening the support for the land with the federal government, and it was on this basis that the draft was approved by 53 votes to 12. Half the minority consisted of a Christian Democrat delegates who saw that the document was now too centralist. The long list of powers translated as concurrent, and the elaborate financial provisions in Chapter 10, as well as the provision for the land execution of federal laws, all of which make German federalism far removed from the American prototype, stand as a monument to this struggle. But so, too, does Article 79.3, there is no legal way to abandon the division of the federation into Länder, nor to terminate their participation on principle in legislation. These provisions are not amendable. In the rest of the document, the most striking idiosyncratic features represent the attempt to revert to the Reichstag tradition of the Nazi absolutism and correct the flaws in the Weimar Constitution, which had contributed to its rise. But idealistically, the set of development in the constitutional system in Germany is now cherished widely over the democratic states. The predicament paradoxically worked to see this as universal welfareism, kind of a sublime goals that the most humanitarians are sharing instantly. And one other notable contributions also to be made, which is very paradoxical, to create the United Nations. The legal theory of Hans Kelsen is idealistic over the legal positivism and the kind of a source of law debate. And UN Charter was heavily influenced by the ideas of Kelsen, Hans Kelsen, and which is combined with the works of a Dean Roscoe Powell. And also the Weimar Constitution, and later the Constitution of Bonn would offer a modality to create the Korean Constitution. We now incorporated many ideas and principles of law in a mixed influence by France, Germany, and United States. The section of a basic liberty was mostly modeled after the United States concepts about human rights. And, for example, the governmental structure would fairly approximate that of European states, particularly Germany and France. Thus, not only does the Bill of Rights move from its place in the middle of Weimar Constitution to become Chapter 1 of the new Bonn Constitution, but there is no corresponding list of duties as there was in the Weimar Context. Furthermore, whereas the Weimar Constitution sanctioned judicial review only by implication, here it is positive and explicit form, and the individual himself is given license to appeal to the court. Three features go beyond the American Constitution. First, the rights are not amendable. They stand over and above the Constitution itself. Second, they are to be interpreted so as to sustain and maintain what is described as the free and democratic order. An individual who uses his basic rights in order to combat the free democratic basic order forfeits them. Third, and unique in all written constitutions, all Germans shall have the right to resist any person or persons seeking to abolish a constitutional order. Should no other remedy be possible. So you can see some of selected articles which is pivotal to understand the development of context. Just as these provisions are clearly derived from the experiences of Sir Wright, so the institutional arrangement derived from awareness of the loophole in the Weimar Constitution, which the Nazis had exploited to seize power. The president abused by von Hindenburg to bring von Papen and then Hitler to office is shown of power and authority. Instead, the chancellor elected by Bundestag is given a plenary authority over his cabinet and can be brought down only if a majority succeeds in agreeing on a successor. Thus, avoiding the factitious majorities of extreme right and extreme left, which has strangled parliamentary government in the Weimar Republic. Again, President Hindenburg and various chancellors had abused the emergency powers article of the Weimar Constitution to suspend the Constitution and to install Hitler as chancellor. In the 1949 Constitution, a two-thirds majority is needed to authorize an emergency situation, and even when this is coming into effect, the legislature cannot be dissolved. The Constitutional Court must continue to sit, and the basic rights contained in Articles 4 through a 20 remain in force. So, and we see the briefs of a French Constitution, which also can be found in that same article as I've introduced. It is a far cry from the German text, the French Constitution of 4th October 1958. The German text, only 45 articles out of 146 relate specifically to the executive, the legislature, and the relationship between them. Out of 92 articles in the French Constitution, 46 do so. We come pretty near the whole truth when we say the power from 11 articles concerned with the French community and 3 transitional articles to bring the new instrument into effect. The Constitution is concerned with one matter alone, to redefine the powers of the executive and the legislature to the immense advantage of the former. In this document, there is no detailed and specific Bill of Rights, only a preamble which speaks of the French people's solemn attachment to the rights laid down in the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, and to the preamble of the 1946 Constitution. These rights, such as they are all but silent on fair trial procedures, and the matter relating to the structure and powers of judiciary and of all local authorities is a cursory. Evidently, the document assumes that these will continue as before. But the President and his surrogate and colleague, the Prime Minister, receive massive new powers. The President has an arbitral power under Article 5th, emergency power under Article 16th, and in association with the Prime Minister has the power to dissolve the legislature. Correspondingly, the legislature is now a tremor. Much of its internal procedures, such as the number and the role of its commissions, is now defined in the Constitution. And this in turn gives the Prime Minister and his cabinet an immense procedural advantage over the opposition. Far from being omnicompetence, the legislature is confined to the passage of laws only, and what topics constitute the subject matter of law is laid down in detail. Any matter not included in this list is reserved to the executive branch. This power to make regulations is conceived as general law. the passage of legislation as the exception. Again, it is different preoccupations of constitution makers that explain the signal difference between this constitution and the German. The 1958 constitution marks the triumph of an 80-year-old effort by the French right, a successful save for the puppet ears of the Vichy regime to replace by powerful executive supremacy the legislative prepotence. The so-called Government Assembly, which from the resignation of President McMahon in 1879 condemned the successive cabinets to instability and importance during the Third Republic and subsequently the Fourth. In the face of the Algerian crisis, French cabinets found themselves unable to find a broad consensus of public opinion on which to base the actions. The Algiers Revolt of 1958 and the subsequent threat of military coup proved the fragility of Fourth Republic. Of its morbid body through the Gaullist, who seized the occasion to elevate the candidate to premiership to draft the constitution to fit its imperious nature and express its elevated conception of the presidency and its contempt for political parties and for parliamentarism. Yeah. Can you give your name? Yes. And this sheet is already used for sharing. Okay. We briefly review the two systems of a constitution and the key articles about the role of each branch of government and a structure of those. And you see, it is important to get awareness of a historical context about the development of a constitutional culture. It is essential to keep on eyes about history, required very critically of our endeavor on contemporary analysis of law. The kind of idea also reflects for example, on other branches of thinking, American realism or other context of a European politics could be more realistically understandable when we see the nature of a history and the wake of lessons of the political structuring or arrangement. So they went to our lecture very briefly, and we now turn to see a judicial review over the country. Despite the difficulties that are perceived in civil law countries as standing in the way of system judicial review of the constitutionality of legislation, there has been considerable movement in the years since World War II to the establishment of some form of a review of legislative action. This is especially so in those countries that have adopted constitutions containing guarantees of enumerated fundamental rights and where the constitution can be amended only by a special procedure rather than simply by the ordinary legislative process. The gradual introduction of judicial review has taken various forms in the civil law system. As is the case with parliamentary government, classifications of legal systems in this area do not always coincide with civil law. Common law lines of a demarcation. In the as far as judicial review is concerned, France and England would appear to fall within one group of countries where its existence in a technical sense is denied, while Italy, West Germany, and the United States come within another group where judicial power to review legislation not only exists, but is actively exercised by the court. In between are several countries which in varying degrees have admitted the principle, but where the courts have been relatively cautious in implementing it. And in printout, you see some enlightening introduction about this area of a discussion. A summary of 1984 Scientific Colloquium of the International Association of Legal Science on Judicial Review and its Legitimacy, which is authored by Joel Lewis. And it is comprehensive and also essential to see the key points about development of judicial review in European countries. Now, I promise to make it available to you for your reference. But with turn briefly over to a judicial review in France. The peculiar history of judiciary in France is identification with feudal oppression, its role in retarding even moderate reforms in pre-revolutionary France, the post-revolutionary reaction against and the vestigial distrust of judges, plus the comparatively non-prestigious role of the modern civil servant judge, as militated against placing the power to review the constitutionality of legislation in the judiciary. The ordinary civil courts are not even permitted to review the legality of administrative action, this task being reserved to the administrative tribunals within the executive branch. So, when France in 1958 instituted a system of constitutional review of laws passed by Parliament, it created a new governmental organ, the Constitutional Council. So, as you see, the typology of European judicial review would be found in a separate system, distinct from the typical line of a judicial authority. For example, you can find the contrast starkly in the judicial system of the United States. It is a unitary system where all courts are submissive to the uniform governance of one Supreme Court. So the court hierarchy is simplistic, but in the context of European states, the hierarchy would be decentralized. But as I have said, the German system usually favors the preemption and superiority of a constitutional court over other branches of a Supreme Court. The Constitutional Council in France is authorized to review laws, but only at the request of the executive or the legislature. Only before, you see this word, before, it is important to distinguish other forms of a judicial review. Usually, most forms of judicial review adopt the aftermath system of any repugnant statutes or acts. They usually condemn the unconstitutional acts or statute after the case was disputed in each jurisdiction. So that is a distinct point. Before promulgation, and only for the limited purpose of ascertaining whether the laws are in conformity with the constitutional division of power between the executive and the legislature. Of course, the effect of court rulings also vary across the jurisdictions. For example, in the United States, theoretically, the order of calls to term some acts unconstitutional is effective only on the case they handle in the court. But practically and politically, it is influential to affect, in consequence, the concerned legislature Congress to have them modified to comply with the guidelines of court. But theoretically, the separation of powers principle operates to bar against each other in a strict sense between a judiciary and other state powers, powers of state government and federal Congress. But you can see some of detailed nature of rulings in the formal courts. So it is generally impacting of the public and typically through the press, and that is generally accepted as a law. And the kind of function will later be revisited in the style of a court-written opinions. For example, France has very concise form of a court opinion. That implies the judiciary may not involve extensively over a social issue. Their usual job would rather goes to the kind of application of a specific codes and provisions which are prearranged by lawmakers, political powers. So the political powers are relatively superior to the judiciary, which is also having some reason of historical background. For example, the judicial people have raised enmities or kind of hostilities against the public, and so the complex elements coming forward to shape our understanding about a comparative law context. So, as Capelli has written, the Constitutional Council was meant to be a mere watchdog of the prerogatives of the executive. However, in 1971, the Council claimed for itself and has since exercised the power to review laws prior to their taking effect for conformity with the Constitution generally, including the unwritten fundamental principles of the French Republican tradition. This and other strolls in the wind indicate that even France is moving away from the older, rigid view of a separation of powers. And also I have some references about a specific articles of a French Constitutional Council. So I also promise to deliver this later in the class. And some decisions helpful to your understanding of this course. And for the comparators, the abortion cases across two continents are interesting to investigate the inaction, interchange of a legal culture and system. And then, what are the features of judicial review in West Germany? In Austria, Italy, and West Germany, constitutional courts were established after World War II as part of judicial system. These constitutional courts are special separate institutions within the judiciary with their own jurisdiction and judges. In West Germany, when a party raises a constitutional objection to statute involved in any civil, criminal, or administrative case, the court hearing the case will refer the question to the Constitutional Court for decision if it thinks that the statute is unconstitutional. When the decision of the Constitutional Court is issued, the original proceeding is resumed. In contrast to France, where the courts are not competent to sanction violations of individual constitutional rights, the West German Constitutional Court also hears complaints filed by individuals aggrieved by unconstitutional official actions, provided they first exhausted their own remedies, the other remedies. So the kind of finality principle was adopted to enforce the authority of a constitutional decision. The aggrieved party must have exhausted all the available remedies to invoke the rule of a constitutional court. And also, the concept tends to the lecture of international law. For example, the state may have a surrogate power to protect their citizens. In the province of international law, the citizen is generally not a legal entity to seek any remedies from the international public court. In that case, in that surrogate context, the finality principle operates to require the person to exhaust all the available remedies arranged within that specific domestic jurisdiction. And this principle was also incorporated in contemporary statute of a Korean Constitutional Court. In addition, certain governmental agencies or officials can test the validity of statute in the Constitutional Court, even though the statute is not involved in an existing dispute. The decisions of the Constitutional Court, unlike those of ordinary courts, are binding on other courts in future litigation. Then, you see, the Constitutional Court of Czechoslovakia, which is considered a fourth nation, modeling after the judicial review based on the constitution in Europe. And also some competing views were raised to get Austria as a fourth nation of a constitutional review in Europe. But at a certain, around 1920s, some of Eastern European countries created the constitutional review system in ways to administer these state matters. And our work needs to be further on a public law course and ordinary course. I'm afraid we may have next class, but I'll beg some more minutes to deliver a little further. So, in a typical civil law system, the various types of disputes that are handled by courts of general jurisdiction in the United States are entrusted to or more separate hierarchies of specialized courts, each with its own Supreme Court. The jurisdiction of the ordinary courts typically is limited to criminal law and private law disputes. The tribunals which adjudicate most public law matters and most disputes in which the government is a party are separate from the ordinary court. In some countries, as in France, the administrative courts are within the executive rather than the judicial branch, although care is taken to assure their independence from regular executive functions. In other countries, West Germany, for example, the administrative courts are one of two main court systems within the judiciary. In either model, it is necessary to have some mechanism for resolving disputes about which court system has jurisdiction over a particular case. In France, a special tribunal of conflicts has been created to decide whether a case falls within the administrative or the ordinary jurisdiction. Nor is the problem free of controversy in the West German system, where there are a number of separate hierarchies of courts. But the basic rule there is that the courts have power to determine their own jurisdiction and to transfer cases of which they decline jurisdiction. A final decision refusing jurisdiction is binding in the transferring court, which may, however, transfer the case to still another court system. Although the French model was shaped by specifically French historical circumstances, it has been more widely imitated than the German system of separate judicial jurisdictions. Because administrative law was largely a creation of the 19th century, it was natural that the early French experience would be drawn on by many other countries as they searched for mechanisms to control their rapidly growing public administrations. As noted earlier, the French revolutionary doctrine of separation of powers seemed to require that the actions of administrative bodies and disputes among or involving them should not be decided by the judiciary. Thus, the administrative dispute settling mechanism had to be located elsewhere. In Napoleonic times, this authority was vested in Council of State, which began as a body of advisors to the king under the ancient regime, and later developed into the central organ of governmental administration. The membership of the present Council of State is composed of professional public administrators, whose backgrounds and training are quite different from those of the ordinary judiciary. To this day, the Council of State performs its dispute settling function through a special election, which is separate from its regular administrative functions. In the first instance, an administrative dispute normally is brought before one of several lower administrative courts. There is no intermediate court of appeal. The Council of State functions as the appellate court for all these lower courts, and also as the court of first and last instance for certain types of cases, such as where the constitutional status of an administrative act is challenged. It will be recalled the constitutional review by the Constitutional Council extends only to parliamentary legislation, not to other governmental actions. But under the 1958 French Constitution, the legislature has power to legislate only in enumerated areas, leaving an extensive residual lawmaking power to the executive. In a landmark decision of 1959, the Council of State boldly asserted and has since exercised power to review this executive legislation. The result is that an institution which is theoretically part of the executive branch has exclusive power to review the legality or constitutionality of the acts of the executive. The great independence and prestige of Council of State, however, supported in its assumed law as the second constitutional code in France. So I wasn't prepared to show the figure contrasting the core system between against other countries, and some of simplistic form of showings to help you in this lecture, but I'll also get it later for your reference. So the French court system with the Council of State at the head of the Minister of Acts. It is a Supreme Court about the public matters, and the Court of Cassation at the head of the ordinary courts. A two separate system were arranged to respond to the judicial matters in France, and the tribunal de conflict standing ready to resolve a conflicts of jurisdiction. It should be noted the Council of State, while serving as the Supreme Court for the Minister of Litigation in its action the contentions, is purely a administrative organ in its actions of the minister. So the weakness of a court characteristic would be easy on your understanding. A few than half the members of the Council of State are chiefly engaged in judicial work. The remainder carry out as administrative functions, which include serving as general legal advisor to the government and to individual ministers on matters of finance, internal affairs, public works, and social programs. Brown Garner, comparators, have pointed out on this point. It is this internal physical division of labor between the administrative sections and the judicial sections that has permitted the Council of State to overcome the charge of being judge in its own cause. But as they also point out, at bottom, the Conseil d'État, certain councils, remains part of the administrative machinery of the French state, although highly specialized part. Right? They deal with the matter in party, in the context of party system, as you see normally in the courtrooms around us. But their tendance greatly slanted on the administrature that we usually see across jurisdictions. And the way of rulings or the best decisions couples to favor the administrative action in its primacy. Historically, in Germany, unlike in France, separation of powers was not understood to require the administrative courts to be outside the judicial system. Rather, they constitute one of 5 principal separate court systems within the judiciary. In contrast to the United States, where a single federal Supreme Court stands at the base of a pyramid of all lower and intermediate federal courts, West Germany has several judicial pyramids, each with its own jurisdiction and each headed by its own Supreme Court. The 2 main hierarchies are the ordinary courts headed by a Bundesgericht and the administrative courts headed by Bundesverwaltungsgericht. In addition, there are hierarchies of labor courts, tax courts, and social security courts. The highest social security court. The highest court in each system is the federal court, but the trial courts and intermediate appellate courts are state courts. The Federal Constitutional Court is yet another separate part of this system. not only exercising the power of judicial review, but also hearing complaints about violations of constitutional rights and deciding disputes of a constitutional nature among the various governmental organs and entities. The West German administrative courts have jurisdiction over a public law disputes generally, except for constitutional issues, and except for those administrative matters which have been assigned to specialized tax and social security courts. There are 3 levels of administrative jurisdiction: the administrative tribunals, intermediate appellate courts, and the Bundesverwaltungsgericht, which is Supreme Administrative Court. So, we are now left with 2 topics, an ordinary course and European institutions in the contemporary context. The brief of these 2 topics will be our next work in studio class. So I now will stop here. Any question? Okay, thank you. See you in the next class.